Hey, it's Social Anxiety Day on The Anxious Truth, episode number 159, Dudes and Dudettes. Welcome back. Welcome to the program. Welcome to the show, which is a little homage to someone that I kind of admired that passed last week, suddenly. So anyway, Andy, I appreciate you. Okay, today we are going to talk about social anxiety, which is a thing I almost never talk about. I understand that. It's a thing I have the least personal experience with. I really have no personal experience with that. And it's probably the anxiety disorder or the part of the family of disorders that I address the least. And for those of you who are dealing with social anxiety, I'm sorry. We're going to try and rectify that. And we're going to rectify it today. I have a guest coming on, my new friend, Sadie. Sadie is making her name for herself online, discussing social anxiety. It's a thing she's intimately familiar with. She has a podcast called Your Social Anxiety Bestie, which is just the coolest title ever, cracks me up. And she also started the Socially Awkward Book Club, which I cannot wait to hear about. So we're going to get to Sadie in a second. We're going to talk all things social anxiety. She's going to share her experience, and I appreciate that. But before we do, give me my 45 seconds here, indulge me. I'm going to tell you about my book, which is called The Anxious Truth, a step-by-step guide to understanding and overcoming panic, anxiety, and agoraphobia. It was written to be a sequential, logically laid out, in-depth, detailed course in how to recover from your anxiety disorder. Take you from lost, confused, overwhelmed, and not even knowing where to start through kind of educated, empowered, encouraged, and knowing how to make a plan and execute it. So that's what I set out to write, and by all accounts, I did that because of the feedback that I'm getting and the reviews that I'm getting. In fact, the book hit #1 in 2 Amazon categories this past week after being out for 10 months. So I'm really proud of that. You guys have been so supportive, and I appreciate that. You can find all the versions of the book and Chapter 1 as a free PDF sample or a free MP3 sample on my website at theanxioustruth.com/recovery guide. And if you already have the book and you're digging it and it's helping you, head on over to Amazon and write me a quick review. You would be doing me a favor, and I appreciate that. All right, guys, thanks for indulging me when I do that every week. I'm getting so used to it now. I'm getting better at it, I think. Anyway, let's get cooking here. We're going to talk social anxiety with Sadie. Let me bring her on, and I will see you at the end of the episode.
Yep.
Miss Sadie, good morning. Welcome.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you for taking the time to come on. Sadie is my new social anxiety bestie. So, which you'll find
I love
out.
what you did just there.
I see what I did there. You guys don't know yet, but well, it was in the intro. We'll talk about that. So Sadie, we're going to talk about social anxiety today because you got to fill in the giant gaping sucking holes that I have in my podcast about social anxiety, or at least help me get started with that. Tell the people who you are and what you're all about.
Sure. So I'm Sadie. And on my main platform right now is Instagram at Your Social Anxiety Bestie. So that explains what you did there at the beginning. And I have a podcast also called Your Social Anxiety Bestie. And basically, I was diagnosed with severe social anxiety in 2018 after, like 10, 15 years of just thinking I was extremely shy, but not really understanding why I felt so wrong and lost and just really struggling, but not knowing anything about mental health. And then when I was diagnosed and I read up on social anxiety, I was like, oh, that explains a lot. And then I went to therapy, did CBT therapy. And at the same time, I've always liked writing. And despite having social anxiety, I have sort of a part of me that enjoys putting myself out there. So I started a blog. And I've just kept at it since then. It was Blushy Ginger back in 2018. And now it's
a good name.
Your Social Anxiety Bestie and the podcast and the book club.
All right.
So
it is definitely growing. I can see that.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because I don't even know how I found you, how we first kind of accidentally crossed paths as it works on Instagram. But I really enjoyed seeing you talk about your CBT and therapy challenges. That's really cool. You're very open about like, oh, I got to do my stuff. It was one of the first things I saw you do was like, oh, I haven't done my homework this week. And you were a little bit freaking out, but then you came back and was like, it was all right. So it all ended well in the end. But
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So let's talk about that. So let's talk about what social anxiety is, or at least is for you. So this is a thing, This is an experience clearly you are living and you are really embroiled in. You're not a therapist or a clinician or anything like that. This is just you're living your experience and sharing it,
exactly.
Which I so appreciate. So what does it feel like? What did it always feel like for you before you discovered like, oh, this is an actual thing that I have going on?
Yeah. Well, like I said, when I was in high school, it just looked like your typical shy kid / overachiever. Um, didn't speak up in class, wouldn't lift my hand, even though I had things to say. Or when put on the spot, would immediately lose anything to say, just like that mind blank in the fog. But back then, like I'm 35. So when I was in high school, there was not any, I mean, at least for me, there was no awareness of social anxiety, no real discussion of mental health. It's come a long way since then, I think. I mean, I hope.
Mm.
Um, but now that I've learned more about it and I've actually got the vocabulary for it, I would describe it as a mix of fear and shame. Shame is like a recent addition to my vocabulary because I'm reading a book for my book club called How to Be Yourself by Ellen Hendrickson.
Okay.
And she says that a lot of people think that social anxiety is fear-based, but it's actually more shame-based.
Yeah.
It's this need to go hide and conceal and sort of this like inherent, this belief that there's something deeply and inherently wrong with you as a person, even if you can't quite put your finger on it.
Mm-hmm.
And you're terrified that if you put yourself out there, if you open up, it will be revealed. And you don't know what it is. It's just this uncertainty that like there is something rejectable about you.
Yeah.
Um,
I've heard that lately where people are starting to talk about that more.
Yeah.
And I've heard it described as like, well, social anxiety seems like possibly you could describe it as a shame disorder more than anything
Yeah.
else. So a little bit different than the other variants in the anxiety disorder family, terrible family, which weren't in. But so tell me the difference that, in your mind between fear and shame then.
Okay.
It's a good question. Now you just made me think of it. Like how I ask a question and then tell you it's a good question.
It's a good question.
Really?
It's a good question. You should
Is that the look you're going for?
I think when I think fear, I think of the physical symptoms. Like I think of all the physical symptoms that come up when I'm afraid, like shaking, blushing, sweating, being really cold. Like that feels like fear to me.
Yeah.
And also fear of the unknown, fear in the sense that I don't know what would be rejectable about me. I don't know what people's reaction would be. So yeah, fear of the unknown.
Yeah.
And I think the shame is like, that one's harder to, it's like this aversion to opening up. Like you can see me, but nobody else can see me. But it's like this like turtling motion. Like there's something that I have to hide and protect. It's a hard one to explain.
Yeah, it's interesting because this is the first time anybody's ever really made me think about this. And if you think about fear as it exists in things like panic disorder and agoraphobia and the stuff that I'm normally addressing, it's almost it's kind of internal. It feels external and pressing on you, even though you could argue that we're generating it with our reactions and stuff. But it feels like an external threat. Something is wrong. I got to get away from this fear. I got to get away from these feelings. Even though it might be internally generated or perpetuated, it feels external. But I'm guessing that shame, is coming from inside. There's no external threat there. There's something broken about me, even if I don't know what it is. But I know that the problem is coming from inside me. It's clearly not external. Does that?
Yeah.
I'm guessing here. I'm throwing stuff at the wall. Does that resonate at all?
No, that actually is a nice little piece of the puzzle, because if you're ashamed of something inside you and you don't know what it is, then it's very scary to go out into the world and you're like, I don't know. Is today the day that it is revealed that I am bad and broken and there's something wrong with me?
Yeah.
So yeah,
okay.
Definitely. It's like if you're okay with who you are inside, and that has been a big part of my healing, becoming more self-accepting and self-compassionate. I have that fear less and that shame less because I'm more okay with me. Like I'm good with me.
Yeah.
Not 100%, but I don't feel like I'm hiding this secret all the time.
It's interesting because you would think then, as opposed to calling it a fear disorder, where it's just like, and I've heard therapists talk about social anxiety exposures, make your phone calls, go talk to strangers, blah. Yeah. And I'm sure that's part of it. I'm sure you're doing all of that stuff. But when you maybe get a grip on the fact that like, well, yeah, those things make me afraid, but they make me afraid because, and we're always talking about navigating through intentionally tolerating and navigating through discomfort to learn that you can tolerate that. But my guess is you have another layer there, which says, I can not only tolerate the discomfort, I can begin to learn experientially that I'm actually not broken inside and I can reveal myself bit by bit. So.
Yeah, definitely. And the exposures and stuff like that, and just practicing social skills and learning tools. That was my CBT, my cognitive behavioral therapy group.
Yeah.
That's what I did there. But then after that, I did a year of one-on-one psychodynamic psychotherapy
Yeah.
with a psychiatrist. And that's where we got more at the shame and the underlying, like the roots of it, because CBT was a lot more present day symptomatic,
Yeah.
like skills based. But that year long, actually it was 15 months because of the pandemic, but
Yeah.
that got at the roots of it. So those two things combined were very, very helpful.
Okay, I'm digging this because we talk about this stuff all the time, you know, that whole root cause thing. But for someone in your situation, and we always talk about root causes being traumatic, you know, almost by default. Well, is there a root cause? Was there some sort of trauma or triggering event? I mean, maybe there wasn't in social anxiety, but it is important to get below the skills, the coping, the behavior modification, all the things that we talk about in CBT and that, you know, those sort of therapies. I could totally see where the psychodynamic or even the humanistic stuff really matters for social anxiety. Really.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like you would not have been able to progress without doing both of those things, I'm guessing.
Yeah, exactly. And I sandwiched it. Like I did the CBT for social anxiety, then I did psychodynamic psychotherapy one-on-one, and then I just finished CBT for perfectionism. And I think that's how you found me, was those
That was
exposures.
probably it. I did a live with Dr. Menage. She was doing the, do you follow her? Yeah, she's the perfectionism.
I
That's
think
right.
I think I followed her after your live.
That may be, yeah, how we kind of like how you surfaced for me. Yes. That's so interesting. CBT and then some psychodynamic stuff and then CBT again.
Yeah.
Just for, let's help people listening in. Cause I think we assume people understand. They hear me talk about CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, all the time. Psychodynamic therapy is more along the lines of that traditional, what you think therapy is. You sit and talk and you examine past experiences and maybe talk about your childhood and formative years and formative events. Was that your experience with a
Yeah,
dynamic
absolutely.
therapist?
It was an hour a week, and it was a lot of guided questions. You know, like my psychiatrist never told me the answers. I still don't know if she knew the answers that I didn't find, but it was an interesting process. Like the first sort of breakthrough or milestone was developing a little bit of self-compassion, which I had really resisted for probably the first 3 months. And then there was this sudden no, not sudden, but I just realized in one session that I was talking about myself more gently. Because at the beginning of therapy, she would say things like, okay, so you said whatever it was that I said about myself. What would kind and compassionate Sadie say if she were sitting in the room? And I would be unable to think of anything kind or compassionate to say to myself. But then I started being able to do that. And that was very interesting to be able to do that.
That must have been a real eye opener or a change in perspective. Yeah. To realize that, oh, wait, I never do that. I never do that for myself.
No, I don't even know what that sounds like.
Yeah.
And then suddenly you're starting to catch yourself talking in extremes and like, I never do this. I always do that. And you're like, really? Like, is there maybe some shades of gray there?
Yeah, really? Do I always? That's such a fascinating experience. I'm so glad that you're sharing it here. And I got to believe that inability, or at least the habit of not being compassionate or being harsh and judging yourself, has to come from that idea, that basic idea that like, oh no, there's something wrong here. Why would I, you know, if my car is smoking and flames are coming out of it, I'm not going to talk nicely about it. It's broken. I'm going to keep saying it's broken. I'm going to keep, and if all you saw was smoke coming out of your tailpipe and flames under your hood, then sure, you're going to keep describing yourself that way, I'm guessing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You're like, yeah, okay, that's great. But there actually is something wrong with me though.
Right.
Like everyone else that you've seen, sure, but I'm different. I'm actually like shameful.
Really? Did you feel that way? Kind of like,
there were parts of me that were sort of like, okay, like not she thinks, but she wants me to think of myself more compassionately, but that's just because she doesn't know me well enough yet. Like we haven't gotten down to the root problem yet.
Yeah.
And eventually we'll get there and then she'll be like, oh, you're actually broken.
Wow, that is amazing to me. I'm telling you right now, there are thousands of people listening right now that are literally banging on the table and like, yes, that's me. I know they are. You don't even know probably the impact you're having right now with these words. Because we see it in people who are dealing with the other disorders, the other forms, the more CBT or metacognitive, you know, that sort of stuff, the GAD, the panic disorder, the agoraphobia, that sort of stuff. Everybody comes to the table feeling that way. Like, okay, I see what you're saying, Drew. It makes all kinds of sense. I get it intellectually, but you don't understand me. Like, no, 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 no.
Mhm.
I really can't do it. Wait till you find out that I'm special. I
Yeah.
can't do it. So it's fascinating to see somebody who came, to the table from a social anxiety standpoint with that sort of shame underneath. Oh, no, no. Wait till you get to know me. Then you'll see.
Yeah.
You've been wasting your time, lady. Right? Is that it?
Yeah, exactly. And that was one of the things we learned in CBT for social anxiety, that people with social anxiety have a tendency to think that like there is something secretly wrong with them, and it's just a matter of time.
Yeah. Before the world sees it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so everybody sees it, I guess. Your
Yeah.
therapist, your friend, your partner, your employer. Was that kind of driving? So let's talk about what your life looked like before you were
Hmm.
diagnosed, so knew what it was, start to educate yourself and start to, get some therapy for it. What did it look like? What were the restrictions? What were the
Mm.
limitations? What was the pain there? And
Okay. Yeah.
you could be a surface or as deep as you want. You don't have to say
Yeah.
anything, I guess.
I like to be candid, sort of rip
Okay.
off the
I,
Band-Aid
I see
reel.
that. Yeah. You don't seem to be shy about talking about things. So
No,
yeah.
which is another interesting point. I don't think I am a shy or introverted type, but that's a whole other question. Um, yeah. So before I was diagnosed, I knew that I was anxious. And I started taking medication in 2012 or 2011 when I moved in with my now husband. And I had been living sort of in downtown Ottawa, Canada. So, walking around doing the student life thing, moved here where you need to drive. I live sort of in the suburbs where I live now, and I couldn't drive. I couldn't even drive to the grocery store. I couldn't even sit behind the wheel of the car without getting really, really stressed. And I had also in moving, I had left behind what social network I had there, moved here and was freelancing from home. So also had no social network. So it just sort of like a perfect storm. And I was afraid to go out. I didn't have a social network and I was afraid to meet people. But I also, and I think critically, wasn't happy about it. Like I was a hermit, but I wasn't a content hermit. And I
Right.
think if I had been happily hermiting and happy on my own, it wouldn't have mattered, but I was not happy. And I think that's because I am possibly a socially anxious extrovert, despite what I always thought of myself as. So
Whoa, that's a tough place to be. Socially
yes,
anxious extrovert.
yeah, I'm starting to think that that might be what I am and what a lot of people are, because you think socially anxious, I think a lot of people assume introvert, but it could just be that like you are driven to connect with people and to put yourself out there, as I am,
Right.
and yet that is the thing that causes your anxiety.
This is officially my favorite podcast episode of probably the last
Oh
three
my
or four
god.
months already, and we're only halfway through it. So this is really, really good, Sadie. Socially anxious extroversion is really fascinating, and I think would probably resonate with a lot of people who would think like, "Oh, wait a minute, that does sound like me."
Yeah.
And it's funny from the outside looking in. Though, those of us who really don't have that personal experience or haven't spent enough time to be educated about the ins and outs of social anxiety, I think would say, oh, those are the shy people. Like we just
Yeah,
assume that it's the painfully shy people, but maybe not. Maybe you're. I mean, when I see you on Instagram, your nature does not appear to be shy at all.
exactly.
At
And thank
all.
you for noticing.
Yeah, you're very open and you're very accessible and you're very friendly and you speak well and you're clear and like you seem like the opposite of what we would stereotype a socially anxious person to be.
Yeah,
So
and that's another reason why I'm so passionate about it. People are surprised when I say that I have social anxiety. I mean, not people online who find me that way, but yeah, I've been like nerding out hard on the differences between shyness, introversion, even like highly sensitive and empath and socially anxious, socially awkward. And the reason like these labels sort of matter to me is that social anxiety is a disorder that you want to address and heal.
yeah,
But some of these other things like shyness, those are personality traits that you want to work on accepting and developing some softness towards. But if you don't know which is which, what do you work on accepting and what do you work on addressing?
yeah, trying to change. It's interesting because I had a
Yeah.
conversation with somebody last week about this exact thing. And it was this, so
Hmm.
the whole like, I'm in a conversation and everybody's contributing and I don't know what to say. I'm just listening. Like, well, wouldn't it be crappy if everybody was the talkers? Like
Mm,
we need listeners too. Like all the personality types are needed. We need each other. And that seemed
exactly.
to be a revelation for that person. Like, oh, So you mean I can be this way? It's okay to actually be this way? Like, yeah, that's not something you need to fix necessarily. I mean, maybe it will change over time, but all right. So maybe you're just naturally quiet or more introspective. That's cool. We need you
Yeah,
too. Yeah.
that's okay.
That's okay. Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah.
Fascinating. So you start to go and get help and you start to do the CBT. What changed when you were doing the CBT work?
Mm.
What do you think changed in your life before you went to the next layer of the hamburger, the meat of the hamburger, if you will?
Um, well, I remember the first thing I noticed in like session one was it was a group of about 10 of us, I think. And I think we went around the table sort of introducing ourselves a little bit and explaining our experiences. I could be remembering it a little bit wrong, but I saw the other people being anxious and nervous, and some of them were tearful and emotional and talking about how self-conscious or how bad it felt. Um, and it just made me realize as I was looking at them that I didn't think that they were disgusting or repulsive or any of the negative things that I assumed people thought about me because
Right.
of my social anxiety symptoms. So that was like, it was the first time I had seen other people who were struggling with the same thing. And I realized that it didn't look ugly. It
Yeah.
just looked human and a cause for compassion and empathy, but not something terrible and rejectable.
Interesting. So you could see like, well, when I'm looking at somebody else who's describing themselves as social anxious or who I know is dealing with this problem, you could be compassionate and kind to them and
Mm-hmm.
understand their value and see the good, but also recognize it, but not with yourself. With yourself, no, no, no.
At that time, no.
Yeah,
At that time, no.
I am
Although I will say
broken, and
that,
you know,
like outside of a therapy session, I'm not really able to recognize social anxiety in other people because one of the things I've read is that people with social anxiety tend to have normal to above average social skills. So you can hide it very well and just be suffering on the inside.
yeah,
But I think in that context, people were letting their guards down and just being open about it. So
right.
like it was like the symptoms were more obvious than they might be.
That
I
makes
don't
sense.
want anyone listening to this who has social anxiety to think that it's super obvious. It's actually much less obvious. The symptoms are much less apparent to the outside world than we think they are.
I've also talked to a ton of people who will say that they work extra hard. People with social anxiety seem to work extra hard at like building those skills that maybe the rest of us just sort of let naturally develop. Like when
Mm-hmm.
there's a fear of being judged for that or being exposed, the shame thing comes into it. Like, I got to make sure I am on point here so that no one sees the
Yeah.
brokenness. And I think that's why. So people with social anxiety often look, you would never know because they work really hard at
Yeah.
looking like everything is cool. Even though on the inside, it's like, oh, don't look at me.
Yeah. We put a lot of effort into learning the social script that other people seem to just have access to.
Yeah. Wow. This is so, there's just a ton of cool concepts that we got going on here. The social script, we're going to come back to that one too, maybe in another podcast. So,
Yeah, sure.
all right. So then CBT teaches you some different skills, right? So you
Right.
start to
Yes.
learn to behave differently, and challenge some of those avoidances and things of that nature. What did that look like?
Yeah. So the first half of it was a 12-week program. The first half was the cognitive component. So learning about what socially anxious thought patterns can look like. We talked about cognitive distortions or thought traps. And we learned some of the common ones for social anxiety, which again, the nerd in me just adores. So we learned about like mind reading. And I remember one of the notes I wrote in the margin was, wait, I'm not actually a mind reader. Like I thought this was one of my secret superpowers. I could read other people's minds. And it just never occurred to me that probably like I was wrong because I was assuming everyone thought negative things about me, which is, statistically unlikely.
Yeah.
So mind reading was one of them. Fortune telling, thinking you can tell the future, but
Yeah.
of course it's going to be negative.
And the,
Catastrophic thinking.
I just did a live with Lauren McKeegan, who is the obsessive mind. And we talked about these cognitive distortions. Those felt real to you. Like you truly
Yeah.
believed like, no, I can tell what you're thinking, man. I know I know
Yeah.
what's going on in your head. You thought that was real.
I thought that was real until I started learning that one, that's a thing that people with social anxiety do.
Yeah.
And then I learned, other little tidbits like people with social anxiety are much more likely to interpret a neutral facial expression as negative. So then I started thinking, okay, maybe I'm reading too much into it. We're also, I think people with social anxiety also remember and recognize faces more readily than sort of our non-socially anxious counterparts, and especially if they're negative. So all of these pieces of data, and I really like the data, like the science, like the
Yeah.
research, sort of, it created some wiggle room in my brain to separate myself from these distortions. And I was thinking, okay, maybe I'm not right.
Maybe
Maybe.
I'm mistaken. Just maybe. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
maybe my negative colored glasses, my danger vision goggles are wrong.
So let's start to roll this into the next part of the therapy, because I'm thinking, okay, so now the CBT part lets you put that little air gap between you
Yeah.
and the stuff, right? And you start to recognize the cognitive distortions. Okay, maybe I'm wrong, but I have to believe, if you go back to that shame thing and I'm broken thing, which comes in the next part of therapy, you don't want that to be wrong, because being able to read someone's mind is a protective mechanism, I gotta believe.
Exactly.
Right? So
Yeah.
please don't tell me that I'm not a mind reader, because I need to be a mind reader. It's how I keep people from seeing me.
Yes, exactly. What am I going to do if I can't read minds? Now I can't go out in public. Um,
Yeah, that sounds difficult. So let's go
yeah.
on. So now you hook up with a psychiatrist, by the way. So you're the psychodynamic therapist was a psychiatrist, not a psychologist. Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Like
Well,
old
before
school.
before the psychiatrist, I did the exposure part
Right,
of the
right,
CBT.
right. And what do those
Um,
exposures look like quickly? We're going to go
the,
long because this is just too good to stop.
oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Anytime you need to wrap it up.
No. We're going to keep going.
The first exposure we did as a group was they brought out a big box and put it on the table, and it had a bunch of ridiculous costume things in it. So I had this big, I think I had like a big headband with pink ears on it and some sort of bow around my neck. And everyone had to put something on, and we had to parade through the hospital because it was at a hospital, and each take turns being the leader and just walk through the hospital. We didn't have to say anything, but we had to walk through the hospital for a good 10 minutes, taking turns. And we couldn't stop and say, oh, I'm just doing therapy, like I'm not actually like this, because
Right.
that's a safety behavior. We
Right.
had to sit with the discomfort. And before we started our parade, we had to write down some of our thoughts and our subjective level of anxiety.
Yeah.
And then at the end we had to do it again. And I remember thinking by the end of it, well, that wasn't so bad.
Okay.
That's like one of the first moments I realized that I might actually have a bit of a performance flair. I was like, oh, you know what? That's not so bad being looked at for looking crazy. I kind of feel cool right now.
Which I'm guessing before you went into that exercise must have been like mortifying. I have to do what?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And then you discover like, oh wait, man, I might not be bad at this.
Yeah.
That's
especially
cool.
being the first in line, being the leader was the hardest for me, because I kept looking back thinking, am I walking too fast? Am I walking too slow? Am I being a good leader? So there were like many layers to that experience.
That's cool. So the CBT is about, again, learning to tolerate the discomfort and understand, oh, I can go into this. I can deal with this, which I'm guessing is super important if you're going to take the next step and start digging into things and cracking the egg open, because you're going to be uncomfortable.
Yeah, that's a good point too. Like you need to build up the tolerance to it. It's sort of like being inoculated at low doses against the anxiety, and building up to higher exposures. That's why they had us build a hierarchy of exposures. Like you're not supposed to do the most terrifying thing on day one, because that will not be effective.
Sounds familiar. Anyway, I'm chiding the people who are listening to the podcast and think they're going to cure their agoraphobia in 2 weeks. So there you go. See,
no,
listen
no,
to
be gentle with yourself.
Right. It's always incremental across all the variants. So anyway, all right. So let's move on. So now you move on to psychodynamic therapy. And what does that look like, and how does that change things for you?
The beginning of that one, I had a lot of sort of safety behaviors that I didn't know about, that like intellectualizing. So we would try to have this emotional conversation, and I would start intellectualizing, be like, oh, this sounds like a cognitive distortion. And oh yes, I feel that I notice that I am feeling anxious about this, but not really sinking into the feeling. And I would deflect with humor a lot. Self-deprecating humor is kind of my jam. And she was pretty tolerant and gentle about that. I think she knew how sensitive I really was on the inside. But eventually she taught me not to brace. She called it emotional bracing. And she said it was like if you have a sore stomach and you go to the doctor's office and they start like pushing on your stomach to try to find where it really hurts, your whole body braces up. And she said, so we want to get you to stop emotionally bracing when we talk about these things.
Yeah.
And that was very helpful.
That's uncomfortable too. Like,
yeah.
So whatever comes up, comes up.
I was able to carry that.
Yeah. Okay. So you she stops you from bracing and starts to uncover some of those safety and deflecto behavior. Captain Deflecto rides in with this big shield and just starts deflecting stuff around.
I love that.
Yeah, the intellectualizing thing is super interesting too, because I see that with people with GAD. People with generalized anxiety disorder, they will continually like, okay, I got it now. I know what to do. And they can start reciting metacognitive theory back at us. And they know, oh yeah, I'm doing this. And then I'm following this. And here's the distortions. Like, yes, but you're still not actually sitting in the discomfort. Yeah. So that is super interesting for people to hear you say that. That's a real world application. Like, no.
You just cannot unclench emotionally a little bit.
Yeah. Like actually have to let that discomfort be there. Stop trying to analyze it and explain it. Like, oh, if I know what it is, then I'm okay. Like, no, you're still not okay until you feel it. Did you have to do a little, and again, you don't have to answer anything you don't want to answer, but did you have I know they're going to want to know this. Did you have to do a lot of digging into like, and again, I don't know your parents. I'm sure they're lovely people. I don't know. But like, my mom didn't hug me enough. I know people ask these questions, was I, emotionally abandoned as a child? Were those themes that came through that in therapy?
Yeah. We had to really dig at, she sort of explained it as, we want to find out the roots and what happened in the past that may be affecting your relationships in the present. Because being able to be intimate and close to people, even platonically, is still one of my struggles. Yeah. So we talked about the past, and I can sort of share without putting any particular person on the spot, but I have had like some challenging family experiences, including with alcoholism in the family, and that can be a big piece of developing certain things like social anxiety, perfectionism, people pleasing.
Yeah.
So we looked at that. And then another big part was my role as a mom, because I've got 2 kids. And when you already sort of don't feel okay with yourself as a human, to then become a parent, it really exacerbated all those fears. So that was a big chunk of the therapy, just starting to feel okay as a mom. Like, what for a perfectionist who has social anxiety and wants to be the perfect mom, what does a good enough mom feel like? What does that feel like? So it was intense.
Yeah. And I'm guessing part of the answer to that, we don't spend too much time on that, but I think part of the answer to that is, what does it feel like to be the perfect mom? And the real answer is, I don't know, and I will never know. And I have to be okay with that. I have to be okay with possibly not being the perfect mom. Yeah.
Yeah.
You have to flex
and not knowing until 20 years from now what mistakes I made.
Right. Which is the plight of every parent parent on the planet right now. You don't know until they try and kill you in your sleep when they're 22, so I get it. So interesting. And then you went back again, and you circled back to CBT. And what was the deal with that? What brought you back to that? That was the bottom bun on the hamburger.
Yeah. Well, that was at the same anxiety research clinic as the social anxiety one. Social anxiety is their introductory level CBT. Yeah. And then they've got next level ones that you can access after doing the first level ones. So like, I could have done perfectionism or assertiveness, or I think those were the 2 big ones. And I didn't feel ready for assertiveness because I had been struggling so much with the exposures at the end of the social anxiety one. Yeah. So I went with perfectionism, which is a common feature of a lot of anxiety disorders, at least social anxiety, as I understand it.
Generalized
and you sort of
anxiety
see why.
Disorder. Also GAD, huge driver of GAD. Yeah.
Yeah, like you want to perfect your environment and perfect how you interact with it. And if you have social anxiety, then you want to be the perfect person, because nobody can reject the perfect person. I mean, that's sort of simplifying it, but
No, but that makes a whole lot of sense. You're just dropping just one bomb after another here. This is so good. Okay, so you went with perfectionism.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm guessing, and the perfectionism CBT, or the course into perfectionism, is all about just not being perfect and dealing with that in the end.
Yeah, which is really, I don't like that.
That's really icky.
It's icky. I haven't had as much time to process that one because it's just finished.
Yeah. All right, but you're taking really good steps. Do you feel like there's a big difference in your life now? I know you're still working on it. We're all a work in progress forever, but like, have you seen big changes?
Yes, definitely. The biggest change, I mean, I sort of like the big changes are, I don't think I'm a terrible person anymore, which is nice. And
I got that
honestly,
going for me.
The fear hasn't really gone away. Like, I still get scared, but I can tolerate it now. I've developed a tolerance for it. Yeah. So I still get a lot of the physical symptoms of anxiety, like the trembling. If I go on Instagram live, like my whole head vibrates and shakes, and my jaw shakes, and I still get the symptoms, but they don't mean what they used to.
Yeah.
They don't mean as much about me as they used to.
Yeah.
So I'm able to do things like have a podcast or come on a podcast. Um, yeah, I
All
still
right.
have ways to go, but
That's okay. And I think, as you go, those things, you start to habituate to all those things, and they don't have the intrinsic meaning that they used to have to you.
yeah,
So they have less power, and
exactly.
oh,
That's the biggest thing.
yeah, over time, I'm sure those will decrease too. You're excellent. I mean, here in terms of this conversation, I could not ask for a better guest. So
Thank you.
clearly you're on the way, which is great. Let's talk about, so you were always enjoyed writing and you were blogging, and then,
Mhm.
I Need a Podcast was the 2019 equivalent of I Need a Blog in 2011. So
Yeah,
it became a natural, what made you fire up a microphone and start talking?
I realized that I actually like to talk, which is weird. Um, I think I started it shortly after or around the time I was a maid of honor at my best friend's wedding, and she asked me to do a speech and in front of like 100 people. And instead of just doing a speech, I wrote a parody song to You're Welcome from Moana that fit her wedding, and I sang it, and the audio failed, so I had to sing it with no audio, and I was able to do it, and that just was such a confidence boost. I think I started the podcast shortly after that, where I was like, maybe I like to be the center of attention.
I love that. Such a good story. I'm sure it was mortifying at the moment, but
Yeah, it was actually, I
uh,
mean, it was terrifying, but it was
yeah.
not that bad.
Yeah, it kind of ties into like, all right, I'll put a giant paper mache bow tie on my, and
Yeah,
parade around the house. I could be a performer. Maybe that's what you're
yeah,
destined to be in the end. Maybe you're going to be an entertainer or
yeah,
something. Who
that's
knows?
right. I'll be a stand-up.
I barely know you, and I could see that happening. Clearly, you have a sharp wit there, which is great. But okay, very cool. And the podcast is called Your Social Anxiety Bestie.
Yeah, it started out as Anxious Creators Unite, because I had thought more of focusing on bringing other mental health content creators together and people who want to talk about mental health, because that's been so therapeutic, like self-therapeutic for me.
Right.
But social anxiety has always really been where my heart is and where I feel like I can help people the most. And
Yeah.
that's sort of the next step for me, is like finding out how can I like help people on purpose instead of just telling my story and hoping it helps people. Now I want to help people on purpose, but without being a therapist. Yeah, anyway, that's the next step of my journey. But the podcast is sort of how I'm doing that for now.
Yeah. Well, you have plenty of ways that you can help people on purpose, and we can talk about that. So,
Thank you.
because so your podcast is maybe 6 years. I got a few years on you, so you're me, just in a different subject. A few, and
That is a huge honor.
and I came to you. Yeah. So you're me. I could see that. So if you want, we could talk about that stuff offline.
Yes,
But
please, I would love that.
yeah. So I totally get that. Your experience is tremendously valuable, by the way. Tremendously
Thank
valuable.
you. I
So
hope so.
just that by itself, and you will adapt that into a teaching tool. You'll see. It's clearly it's in you. So
I want to.
yeah. So let's talk about the book club thing. So clearly, books
Yeah.
and writing and literature seems to be a passion of yours, also. And then the socially awkward book club. I mean, come on. That's so good.
I love it so much.
Tell me about that and what's going on with that.
Yeah, so I launched it April 1st, and for now it's on Patreon. So it's called the Socially Awkward Book Club, and we're reading books about social anxiety, introversion, shyness, general personality, mental health. Our first book that we're reading right now is How to Be Yourself, which is a social anxiety book, and it's fabulous.
Yeah.
And the tier that I have for the book club, because Patreon has tiers, is the Book Besties tier, and it's $7 Canadian a month.
Right.
And it's so much fun. We've got a Facebook group, and I posted in the group yesterday saying, you don't have to finish the book in order to be allowed to come to the chat. Like, this is not fiction. There's no spoilers. Don't let the socially awkward book club make you feel socially stressed that you can't come to this thing. Please come.
It's very meta.
So long term, I want to get it off Patreon and have I want to build a whole community, like a socially awkward society where people can come and just be their awkward selves, and like have socially awkward Dungeons and Dragons and socially awkward improv. I don't know. These are just my big ideas, but
I am loving all of that. All of that. I have a few people that you probably talk to that help you with that too, because they share a similar vision of like the socially awkward or the neurodivergent, where everybody brings their own stuff and it becomes this really awesome stew, and just enjoy.
Yes, a socially awkward
It's a
stew
socially
club.
awkward stew, right? So there's so much good stuff in that. All right. I mean, we could talk for another hour, but
We'll have to talk again.
we will. I will absolutely have you back on if you would be willing to do that for sure.
Yes.
We'll do some lives on Instagram and stuff together. So definitely, I want your voice to get amplified as much as possible because
Thank you.
you have such good stuff to say that I can't say. So you're going to have to
Well,
surrogate for me.
Love that. I want to reach the people that are me from 5 years ago and just feel broken and wrong. I just want to give them like a socially awkward hug with my words.
A big old fist bump over Zoom.
Yeah.
If I could fist bump you, I would. So anyway, tell people where they can find you, and I will make sure I link all of your stuff. So if you need to, this is episode 159, so you can go to theanxioustruth.com/159, and I'll make sure to have all of Sadie's links. But otherwise, if they're listening, where can they get at you?
Yeah, so Instagram at Your Social Anxiety Bestie. Very recently, TikTok at Your Social Anxiety Bestie. I had one video go viral. It's at almost 130,000 views, which is insane.
Really?
I'm terrified of TikTok, but it happened to kick off. So TikTok, if that's your thing. And the podcast is Your Social Anxiety Bestie. Basically, everything is Your Social Anxiety Bestie because that's what I want to be to people.
Yeah. Well, and I think you're off to a rousing start.
Thank you.
Go follow Sadie on Instagram and all of the different places, and join the socially awkward book club if you dig books, because that's such a good idea. If I was socially awkward, I would join. But anyway, thank you, Sadie. I appreciate you taking the time. We're going to do this again.
Yes, thank you so much. This was awesome.
All right, let me socially awkwardly stop the recording for a second.
That's my jam.
Yeah, excellent. Oh my God, Becky. That was so good. I so enjoyed that conversation. I cannot even begin to tell you guys how excited I am about this particular podcast episode. Full disclosure, an hour before Sadie came on, I knew we were going to talk today, but I don't prepare much for these episodes. And I was really wondering, boy, this is something really out of my wheelhouse. What am I going to talk about with her? And the conversation turned out to far, far, far exceed my expectations. And Sadie will be welcome back here anytime. So I am going to encourage you guys to go and follow her, especially if social anxiety is your thing, if there's shame in your life, if there's embarrassment in your life, if you think that you are broken, clearly she is you. You are her people. So if you go to theanxioustruth.com/159, I will make sure to have all of Sadie's links there, and she will be a regular for sure. We'll collaborate a little bit more on do video and stuff so that you guys have a chance to ask her questions that she can answer for you, and it's going to be great. So anyway, thank you so much to Sadie for taking the time and, out of her day to spend with us and to talk to us and educate and share experience. I really appreciate that. I'm going to end this one now because it's gone on longer than these usually do lately. I'm going to play you out as usual with Afterglow, written by my friend Ben Drake, who so graciously lets us use this song in the beginning and the end of each episode. And if you want to find more about Afterglow, the song, or Ben Drake, the artist, you can go to bendrakemusic.com. He's a good dude. And if you're listening to the podcast on iTunes or any platform that lets you rate or review the podcast, rate us. Give me a 5-star rating if you think I'm worth it. I think we are. And take an extra minute or two if possible. Write a little review, because if you are liking the podcast and it's helping you, reviews help other people find it. And that's why I spend the time I do on this thing. Anyway, guys, thanks for coming by. I appreciate you hanging out with us as you usually do every week. I will see you next week in the next episode. And remember, this is the way.
Yeah, you're doing fine. It's all around you, you can breathe it in. And this is where your story begins. You got the feeling that you're gonna win. Yeah, you're doing fine. Now in the city and you're living fast. No looking back or dwelling on the past. You know you'll never get another chance.